Hello, my name is Merritt, and today I'm going to do a cover of Silvera by Gojira. I'm going to show you the equipment I use to record it, and I'm going to show you my mix workflow. Let's do it. Alright, the first step in the signal chain is a PRS 7 with bare knuckle Halcyon pickups. The bass I'm using is a Warwick 5-string rock bass with J-style pickups. The microphone I'm using is a TLM 102. The guitar then goes through a tuner, which goes through an EQ, just some slight changes to the pickups. And then for the solo part, I'm boosting it with the Harlow boost. And then for the rhythm tone, I'm using a precision drive with these settings. That's going into my ISP gate, so top. And for the amp, I'm using the beautiful Peavey Invective. I'm going to be using the lead channel with these settings. Bam. And then that is going through a Suhr reactive load box, which then in turn goes all the way through my Apollo Solo, and that's where it gets into the computer. Alright, I'll start off kind of show you what the guitar tone sounds like naturally before we get to the static mix tone. So there's a lot going on. I'll try to get through it concisely. Just real quick, the mix, I'm turning off my mastering chain for this just so I can show you the actual tones. Before I get to the mastering chain, it's just going to be this limiter to bring the level up for everybody listening. Alright, so starting with the kick, I'm going to take you through each sample and just kind of add them in here. This is the first kick. It is the Hanson Audio Molten Kit, Varus Morpheus 22. And then I'll add the one shot later, which is also a part of this. So this is the kick by itself with a little bit of EQ on the top. And then adding in the one shot. And then this is the Sumo Sub, from Jens Bogren. And then I'll take you through the mix bus. DF clip, pretty much going to saturate it and make it a little less pokey, and I think I make it a little bit brighter too, so taking away some low end. So without, and with, and then adding a compressor with a little bit of saturation from this. Sounding pretty crazy now. Rolling off the low end. And then this basically makes it so the low end kind of like pokes back down after there's a sequence. So I'll take it out here. I find it's helpful, especially if your sample has like sustain to the low end. But yeah, that's the kick. All right, moving on to the snare. It's also from Hanson Audio Molten Kit. In fact, the toms, snare, and kit are from that. And then I've got the GGD cymbals here. So this is what the snare sounds like. I think it's Ludwig Festival or something like that. And then I'll add in the one shot. Add in a bit of that ring sound. And then the snare attack. So this is with the room sound. So processing is going to be pretty much the same as the kick. So starting with DF clip. And then transify. Not a whole lot. And then I've got a VCA compressor that's doing a lot of the job. And here's the saturation, so this is it with both. Trying to make it sound crazy. And then rolling off the low end. Yeah, so this is going to be the kick and the snare together. My idea with these is just trying to make them sound big and nasty. All right, moving on to the toms. Let me find where they're actually playing. Probably something like this. I think all of the tom processing is going to be pretty much the same on each one. And I am sample replacing them with another Jens Bogren thing. So I'll play them. And then the mix processing, kind of like the snare, but a little less. So DF clip, again, with the compressor and saturating some of the top so it's not so pokey. Play that with the snare and the kick so you can hear the context of it. And then the overheads, I don't get too crazy with the overheads. For the most part, it's just trying to make them bright and cut off some of the low end without getting too thin. So that's what this is doing, taking out some frequencies, suppressing some of the low end. So this is more dynamics. And it also kind of boosts a little bit of it there. Soothe, it's a plugin that kind of takes away some of the harshness. And then a compressor, just smash, kind of makes it, I'll just show you. So this is it without. See, it does sustain, but not like a long one. It's more like the attack and a little bit of the ambience after. Whereas with the compressor on, the sustain is a lot more of that sort of like glittery sound from it. I don't know if that's the right word, but oh well. All right, and with the room, it's pretty similar to the overheads. With the EQ, I'm just going to be trying to cut off some of the low end so the sustain isn't too crazy and it doesn't get too muddy. And then I am adding this Devilock compressor. Kind of just makes it really crispy and crunchy. So I'll show you without that. So what you're kind of hearing is like reflections in the back. Room is kind of like just drums reverb. And then with the crunchy, crispy thing, it just makes it sound really explosive and crazy. I'll show you what it sounds like in solo by itself, because that's where you really hear the actual change with it. So without, and then with, just really thick. All of those drums are going through these two buses. So first one is going to be reverb. So this one is mostly going to be for the snare, trying to make it sound really massive. Because if I added too much of everything else, it would just kind of get cluttery sounding. So this is without the reverb. And with. Yeah, you really only hear it on the snare. It's sounding even more like a cannon or something. And then this is a parallel compression. This is mostly for just trying to make the shells sound a little bit more crazy, for lack of a better word. So without, with, yeah, kind of making the snare sound like a gunshot. And that's pretty much the drum bus. All right, moving on from the drum bus. I actually don't do that much to my guitars. What's going on with the cab situation? So on the center, I've got the studio standard thing going on. And then I've been trying something new recently. I can't actually combine these two IRs. So one is an IR called One On Press High that I think sounds really good with the Invective. And then the other one is Ownhammer Studio, but you can't import or export sound with it. So my workaround is just adding 2 tracks with it and then summing them into its own little mix bus. So those sounds are going into this one, and I'm just EQing pretty minimally here, just reducing some of the high end. This is a really bright amp, especially with the lead channel. So this is what it sounds like with the EQ. And that is going into this bus. So soothe, because my poor ears, that's going into a compressor. And this is basically just going to duck the guitars when kicks hit. I think it's only about 1 to 1.5 decibels. And it goes, the release is really quick with it. The idea behind it, just trying to get the kick a little bit more impactful. Compression for the low end when it chugs. Got a gate for all the sound in between. And then a widener. So I'll show you what these all do. So starting with soothe. Just kind of reducing some of the ear frequencies. That would be more obvious in the mix, but because everything isn't mixed right now, I'm not going to show you that. So watch how they react when it's palm muting. And then the gate, you can see it'll just jump on as soon as the guitars pop in. I just have this on because when I'm reamping, the guitars usually have some sort of sound through the amp, which will come back through the system, and I just like a quiet mix when nothing's going on. And then the widener, this doesn't do way too much, but I feel like it kind of brings the guitars on top a little bit. Alright, so that's the guitars. Moving on to the bass. So my bass has a lot going on. So how I do this, I'll have one DI track. I'll do it a direct in from the bass into the Apollo. And then I'll put it into parallax and this little compressor and a preamp. Wow. So the preamp is going to be increasing the level and kind of coloring a little bit. And then it goes into a compressor to kind of like keep it a little bit more balanced, which goes into parallax. So this is what this all sounds like. And one of the reasons I really like the Warwick is because it's got that sort of stringy, dirgy sound. But yeah, so what I'll do is I will print that, and then I'll put it across these 4 tracks. So I'll show you what they're doing. The first one over here, sub, this is pretty much me separating out the low end. So I'll put a high pass and a low pass there, and then I'll limit it. So this is what this sounds like. Grit is pretty much the exact opposite. So I'll put a high pass there. And this is what they sound like together. Just a bit more of a controlled version of what's going on in the parallax one. And then this one, distortion. This is kind of like a little rattly high-end thing that makes the strings sound a little bit better. Yeah, it's really subtle, but it's there. And then this one widens the stereo image of the bass. It higher levels, it really does increase phase in a bad way, but in the way that it sits is it's thickening, and it works with the guitars to kind of make one big sound. So I'll play it without it on, and then with. Yeah, if you have headphones on or something, you can hear the stereo just separates. And that all goes into the bass mix processing here. So Soothe, that's going into Pro MB. This is pretty much just controlling the upper mid-range. It might only be going on when there's a kick, though. Let me see. Yeah, so I sidechained the kick here. This is another thing to kind of make the kick pop. And then the next one, I think this is only if I have some sort of bass drop. Yeah, so if there's a bass drop, this will duck the kick out of it. And that goes into a limiter. The limiter is kind of keeping the bass, I don't know. It's probably too many limiters, but the limiter is just locking it in, you know, with the volume. And that's going into a compressor. This is doing the same thing that the guitars are for the kick, so it'll duck it out whenever the kick gets loud. Yeah, about 1.5 dB. And then this is just for string sound, I think. I usually amp up my upper mid-range string sound, so it cuts it out. I just realized on OBS I was showing my guitar cam this whole time. Oopsies. There we go. That was all the instruments. I'll show you how I kind of bust them all together. So first, this thing. I saw George Lever, who mixes Sleep Token and Loathe, do this, and I don't really know what it does, but I like his mixes, so it's there. The next thing, this is all just stolen stuff. This is something that I saw Nolly do to duck the snare hit, and my snare gets really loud with all the samples, so I'll kind of show you that on and off. So let's see. So this is with it off. And then with it on. Yeah, not doing way too much, but enough. And then I'll have that going into my mix bus compressor here, which is also not doing too much. What I'll have that doing is basically trying to reduce the amount of level once it gets to the limiter, so it'll be a little less pokey, and the mastering doesn't have to do way too much. Before I get to the actual mastering, I'll just show you what the vocal chain's looking like. So my vocal chain is kind of crazy, but similar thing going on, just trying to make it a little bit brighter and a little less harsh. So it's got soothe, it's got a gate, trying to keep the low end not so dynamic. And I'll also run it through a saturation de-esser, and then I do most of the stuff in Manly Voxbox, and then in Pro Q. So I already printed this stuff, so this is what it sounds like in solo.
Your heart is pounding in the brain. Yes, they drag you naked in the mud.
So this is without the print.
Your heart is pounding in the brain. Yes, they drag you naked in the mud.
As you can see, especially for a live performance, it kind of gets shaky as I'm singing in and out of the mic. So that compressor's doing a lot of work there. So that's what's going on with that. And it's a similar thing for the spoken words for the chorus. And then I have an effects chain, a doubler, a couple delays, and 2 reverbs. That is another thing I stole from Jacob Hansen. And all of that effects kind of goes into its own thing. This is what that sounds like.
In the brain. Yes, they drag you naked in the mud.
And then when those meet my actual vocal chain, which is all dry, it'll be hitting Soothe again and Pro Q. Wow, I really use a lot of Soothe. So to show you one time what the entire vocal chain looks like.
Some moaning about fate and change. Stand up on your feet and raise. With every fall you get the pain, you learn the lesson.
Yeah, so the effects are kind of just making this bigger space. Makes a lot more sense in a mix as big as this one. So now I will show you what the whole mix situation looks like through the master. I'm not like a master expert, so I'll show you what I've gleaned over the years. So Pro MB, so this is kind of keeping the low end less dynamic. Moving into Soothe, and then something called Goldfoss Master, which pretty much brightens it up. That goes into Saturn. What I'm trying to do here is saturate the high end especially so I can get a bit more crisp to it. And then that's going into a Pro Q, and then another widener across the mix. And then the way that I'll make it loud is I'll use K-Clip and Pro L. So about now is where I would turn this little limiter off and show you the actual master of the mix. So here we go. That's pretty much the whole mix. Well, that was Silvera and a little bit of mix stuff. Probably TMI, but oh well. Hope you enjoyed it. If you like it, please feel free to check me out. If you have any feedback, please let me know. I'm always trying to learn. Bye-bye.